Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Duke's Counterfeit Wife by Caroline Lee. Narrated by Philip Alces. Prologue. Griffin Calderbank frowned at the ridiculous advertisement plastered across the front page of his favourite newspaper. His Grace, the Duke of Peasgood, being of sound mind and frustratingly deteriorating body, has decided to eschew standard practice in choosing an heir. Having never married, and with no nephews, male cousins, or even particularly likeable male second cousins, he will choose the next duke from the following list of eligible names. Each of these men bears a relation to the current duke through his mother or father's line, and should apply to the address listed below, should they wish to be considered. The successful candidate will prove a strong sense of familial bonds and loyalty, as family is what his Grace, the current duke, values most, lacking it as he is. He understands there are some families in the world which resemble a pack of ravaging hyenas. These need not apply. Fucking ridiculous. Still, Griffin couldn't seem to make himself fold the paper and toss it aside, as it deserved. What kind of madman chooses his heir in such a preposterous manner? His eyes were drawn down the list of names, at least 50 of them, which followed. He was torn between horror and laughter, until his gaze landed on the second column, and he damned near choked on his tongue. Sir Michael Cumhard, the current Duke's third cousin once removed, George Stoughton, the Earl of Bonkinbone, the current Duke's fourth cousin twice removed, William Stoughton, his brother, same, Arthur Wankham, the current Duke's fourth cousin twice removed, Griffin Calderbank, the current Duke's third cousin once removed. Now was the time to scoff, Griffin was certain. He recognized some of those names. He didn't know them, not personally, of course, but some he knew were cousins. His father's mother had been a Cumhard, and the Wankhams were distant cousins on his grandfather's side. But a duke? Griffin shook his head and finally tossed the paper down as it deserved. Should have thrown it into the waste bin where it belonged, or the fireplace, or the Thames. A duke! He snorted under his breath. Being the only son of a country vicar, who himself was the younger son of a younger son of a baron, Griffin had been raised with a vague sense of gentility, and no money whatsoever. It had been a bitch through school, but he'd made his way ever since. And now some fucking duke had the bollocks to claim they were related. He snorted again, louder, and ran his hand through his hitherto neatly combed hair. Sundays were his only days at home, and he should be spending them with his children. But Mrs. Mac, when she'd brought him his coffee and buns, had told Griffin he was the first one awake, and he'd been grateful for an uninterrupted hour to spend leisurely perusing the news. Until this. Now his coffee sat sour in his stomach, and he wished he'd never read the bloody thing. But it had become a daily ritual, since his family's return from America, to scour the papers for hints into the investigation against his old employer. The reports at the Daily Constitutional had always seemed so level-headed, but this was nonsense. A knock at his study door had him pushing himself straighter in his chair. "Come," he barked. His daughter poked her head through the door. "Good morning, Papa. Can we join you?" "Aye, of course." Assuming this meant Rupert was finally dressed and ready to leave, he gestured his children into the sparse room. "Since I promised we'd skip church this morning, would you like—" His plans bit off when he saw who followed Marcia into the nearly barren room he'd commandeered for himself when he'd chosen this townhouse 6 months ago. Griffin's lips turned down into a scowl. "What are you doing here?" "Good morning, Gruff," the little shite declared, strolling into the room as if he owned the place. Bull Lindsay lived next door, in a townhouse with an identical layout, far better furnishings, and a mother who didn't share his last name. An intriguing, infuriating mother, one who made Griffin's blood boil. And your cock hard. The reminder wasn't appreciated. That bloody door should have been plastered over years ago, he muttered, ignoring the rude nickname the lad had taken to using. Aye, Bull agreed cheekily, sauntering toward the desk with his hands in his pockets. But the latch and hinges are on our side. Griffin's palms slammed down atop the desk on either side of the damned newspaper. Then your mother should have plastered over the thing. Ta, urged Marcia in a wounded voice, and when he glanced at her, she was doing that soulful puppy expression. He scowled and sat back. His oldest child might think braids and freckles made her look sweet and innocent, but he knew better. She had too much of him in her to ever discount. Still, he despaired of her decisions sometimes, like her outrageously wrong choice for a best friend. Anyone with eyes could see that Bull Lindsay was some kind of criminal in training, with the way his gaze flitted around the room, never landing on any one thing long enough to truly study it. His hands weren't still either, despite being shoved into his pockets, and Griffin had seen him palm cards and small trinkets with a skill even Griffin couldn't match. And he'd been trained in larceny, for fuck's sake. It didn't help that the lad was handsome in a foppish sort of way, and had a grin which would one day break hearts. But he was 2 years older than Marcia's 14, and from the moment they'd discovered the secret door between their houses, they'd been inseparable friends. Griffin hated the thought of this reckless charmer hurting his daughter, which is why he'd insisted Bull's mother, Miss Felicity Montrose, close up the door. And she, being as stubborn and infuriating as her son, had refused. "Papa, Bull and I want to go for ice cream today." His daughter's request dragged him back to the here and now. "We'll take Rupert too, dinna worry," Bull volunteered, eyeing the few volumes which Griffin had managed to salvage when he'd fled with his family to New York. Those books were precious to Griffin, and his palms curled into fists at the thought of someone else perusing them. Christ! The junior larcenist in training from next door had perfected a look of innocence, and Griffin tried not to read too much into the wee shite's nonchalance. "You're just projecting, because you canna afford to take your children out for ice cream." It was true. Money was tight, and it was unlikely Griffin would be able to pay the rent on this townhouse for next quarter, much less Mrs. Mack's salary or the tuition for the school Rupert deserved. But he would be bloody well castrated before he admitted that in front of his daughter's friend. "All right," he agreed abruptly, rising to his feet and startling Bull, who'd been sidling nonchalantly toward the desk, an innocent expression on his face. "But only if you prove you'll be safe." If his children were leaving this house, he was damned well going to trail them and assure himself they would be safe. If he couldn't reach them in time, he had to know they could care for themselves. With a huge sigh and a roll of her eyes, Marcia planted her hands on her hips. "Fine, although Bull won't let anything happen to us." Griffin kept his opinion of Bull's fighting abilities to himself. "What do you do if an attacker comes at you from behind and grabs your shoulder?" Another irritated huff, and Marcia turned to Bull. "If you'll do the honours." For the first time the lad looked uncertain, wary even. "Good." "Come on, Marsh, not again," Bull whined. "My arse still hurts from last time." And now he deserved what was coming, simply for using the word arse in front of Griffin's daughter.
Don't be a baby. Papa won't let us go otherwise.
Now it was time for Bull to roll his eyes and sigh. But to give him credit, he stepped up behind Marcia and, even knowing what was coming, clapped his hand on her shoulder. "Well, hello there, beautiful." Marcia simpered and battered her lashes ridiculously.
"Oh, I'm flattered."
"Dinna be," Griffin growled, "and dinna hesitate." His children would be safe. He demanded it. With yet another sigh, teenagers were good at making adults feel like idiots, Marcia reached both hands for the larger one clapped on her shoulder. She twisted and pulled, at the same time turning and sweeping one foot out and using her hip for leverage. Bull flipped arse over tea kettle and landed with an oof on the threadbare study rug. Griffin resisted the urge to grin. Instead, he nodded solemnly to his proud offspring. "Well done." If he hadn't known how she did it, he would have missed it. "You've been practicing." Marcia was grinning as she reached down to help a still groaning Bull to his feet.
"Just as often as Bull will help me."
"Usually I make her put down pillows," the lad moaned, rubbing his lower back. "It's not fair that you can do that sort of thing in dresses." Marcia lifted her skirt slightly and stuck out a trim ankle.
"I know. Will you lend me a pair of trousers?"
Bull had the sense to glance at Griffin, who was back to glaring at both of them, before hazarding, "I dinna think I should answer that." Griffin addressed his daughter. "You will only go to the shop around the corner, but you may stop in the park as well." Her face lit in a smile, and she offered a curtsy which would have made her mother proud.
"Thank you, Papa. Come on, Bull, let's go find Rupert."
But Bull wasn't paying attention. He was leaning over Griffin's desk.
"What's this?"
The wee shite craned his head to the side, so he needn't read the headline of the newspaper upside down.
"Some kind of contest."
"It's nothing." Griffin picked up the paper, intending to toss it into the waste bin where it belonged, but the lad was faster. Bull snatched it from his hand, offered a cheeky grin instead of an apology as he danced out of the way, then dropped his gaze to the article. Before Griffin could reach him, the lad had darted behind Marcia as he read, "Should apply to the address listed below," he murmured, then sucked in a breath as his gaze skimmed over the words.
"Did you ken your name's listed here, Gruff?"
"Aye," growled Griffin, "and dinna call me that." Instead of shooting back with a quip, the lad was focused on the paper. "Are you going to write to this Duke?" Marcia stepped toward her friend.
"What are you talking about?"
"Nothing," Griffin barked, glaring at Bull. "It is not important. Toss it with the rest of the rubbish." "Pea's good," muttered Bull, even as he folded the paper.
"His estate's up near Mackenzie Land, eh?"
The lad was Scots for certain. The brogue had confirmed it the moment Marcia had introduced them, after Griffin moved his family and their pitifully few possessions back from New York. There'd been no explanation for why Bull spoke with a brogue while his mother did not, nor why they carried different last names, nor why his mother seemed awkward around the lad. But this was not a mystery Griffin needed to worry about now, not while his family's future was in danger. "How should I ken?" he growled in response to the lad's question. "I've never heard of the man." A lie. Even younger sons of younger sons could marry a duke's granddaughter. But the relation was so tenuous, Griffin had never thought of it.
"It says here,"
the lad hummed as he tapped the folded paper with 2 fingers in that never-still way of his,
"it says that if you have a strong sense of family, you can apply to be the Duke's heir."
As Marcia gasped, Griffin stood, still holding his daughter's hand. "I ken what it says, and I repeat, rubbish, rubbish." The lad didn't reply, but his grey eyes flicked to Marcia, then back to Griffin. As if making a decision, the lad suddenly nodded briskly and shoved the paper under his arm. "Aye, rubbish." He sent a wink to Marcia, which Griffin pretended not to see. "I'll toss it in the bin on the way out." Griffin would have believed him, except he caught the way Bull tapped the paper with 2 fingers once more, then nodded somberly to Marcia. Worse than that was the way Marcia's expression cleared from confusion to trust, and she nodded in return. Whatever the lad was thinking, he'd more or less announced his intention to discuss it with Griffin's daughter, and she trusted him. "Look, you little—" he began to growl, but Bull interrupted yet again. "Dinna fash, Gruff," he announced cheerfully, giving a little wave as he backed out of the room. "Marsh, I'll meet you out front in a quarter hour." "Aye," she readily agreed. "I'll get Rupert ready too." Bull's grin seemed mocking. "I'll see myself out." "That door should be plastered over," Griffin called as the lad ducked out of the door. His own reply was a single hand that popped around the jamb long enough to give a cheeky little finger wave before disappearing once more. Griffin felt his muscles tense at the lad's disrespect. "That—"
"Da?"
Marcia prompted, patting him on the arm.
"Bull's my friend, even if he hasn't figured out how to land so his thigh takes most of the brunt."
Her comment deflated some of Griffin's irritation, and he blew out a breath. "Did I tell you I was proud of you?"
"No,"
she grinned cheekily.
"but I know."
"Good," he said gruffly, pulling her into an awkward hug. "I hope you understand why I make you practice such things."
"Aye."
Her voice was muffled against his chest.
"You want to keep us safe. But nothing will happen to us, Papa. Mother's death was an accident."
"Was it?" But all he replied was, "You're my family."
"I understand."
She patted him once more, then pulled away from his embrace, grinning eagerly.
"And I love you too, Papa. But now I have to go get Rupert,"
she called as she all but skipped from the room. She was so damned excited to spend a few hours eating ice cream with her friend and brother. Who was he to stand in the way? "You'll stand behind her, in the shadows, protecting them, as you always have." At his sides, his hands curled into fists, the familiar pull of old scars more of a comfort than anything else. His firm didn't pay him enough, and Black Rose was still at large, and he'd have to uproot his children once more soon enough. But no matter what happened, he'd keep his family safe. He had to. Chapter 1. Felicity Montrose frowned and peered through the darkness at the secret panel leading from her study to the townhouse next door. It was ajar. Ajar, from an old Scottish word meaning turned slightly, although the knowledge did little to help her at this moment. A sound from behind her made her start, but before she could turn, a familiar feline brushed against her skirts.
"Hello, Cheeseburg," she murmured. "I do not have a treat for you, or any food, really, which makes it surprising you are here when you could be in the kitchens. Are you looking for Bull as well?"
She was new at this motherhood thing, but in the last few months she had become used to sharing time in the evening with her son. Tonight she'd been engrossed in her laboratory and hadn't realized the time. When she finally emerged, the house was silent, and Bull wasn't in his chamber. The study had been the next place she'd checked. The door was ajar, which could mean any number of things. 1, she was being burgled. 2, one of Mr. Calderbank's children had crept out of bed and slipped into her home. 3, The cats had developed the ability to hold down the secret button while lifting up on the hidden latch, although that would indicate a surprising and frankly alarming level of cooperation among felines. 4. Bull had snuck out again. Of the 4 possibilities, she preferred the burgled one.
Based on data collected, it is far more likely to be Bull's fault.
Not the first time she'd caught him using one of her secret doors, which she'd never opened, not once in her 10 years of living here, since he'd moved in. He'd developed a friendship with the children next door, and the 3 of them could often be found causing mischief, or playing cards, or even doing their schoolwork together. But never this late at night. With a sigh, Felicity dropped her arms from around her waist. There was only one thing for it. She was going to have to go after him. If Bull was in fact next door, she would have to fetch him before Mr. Calderbank discovered his presence and had him— Well, frankly, she wasn't certain what the beast would do. Stripes from a whip, keel haul on the Thames, force Bull to walk the plank. As far as she could tell, the man vacillated between grumpy and angry, with a dash of cranky thrown in. Since Bull had moved in, he'd had nothing kind to say to any of them. And while she suspected that was mostly Bull's fault, Felicity knew he blamed her for refusing to board up the door, which opened from her side of the brick wall.
You are putting off the inevitable.
Right. Taking a deep breath, she pulled the door open just enough to poke her head through.
Bull?
She whispered. No answer. Blast. The room on the other side of the wall was dark, of course. She'd only been in the home once, but knew the floor plan mirrored hers. The family which had rented it prior to the Calderbanks used this room as a library, but now the room was empty, and her footsteps echoed strangely on the wooden floor as she stepped inside. Why would the room be empty? She knew Calderbank had recently moved from America, but did he not have the furnishings to fill the house?
Bull?
Felicity whispered again, not really expecting an answer. If he was in this house, he was almost certainly with Marcia, and she didn't even want to think of the consequences of that. Pressing her lips together, Felicity hurried across the empty room and paused at the door to the hall. No light peeked from under any of the doors, but still she hesitated. Marcia's room would be upstairs. It was a gross violation of decency to be in this house unannounced at this hour, and it would be even more so to venture upstairs. Perhaps it would be best to retreat to her own study and wait for Bull there. She could light the lamps and be waiting, arms folded and foot tapping, when he returned. That would show him her authority wasn't to be trifled with. Felicity's brief spurt of mothering, most of which she'd gleaned from women's magazines, faded as she glanced over her shoulder. She'd neglected to pull the secret door closed, which meant Cheeseburg, always on the lookout for food, could escape. At that point she'd have more members of her household in Calderbank's house than her own, which would be silly considering how little furniture the man owned. Better to find her son as quietly as possible, then sneak back home. Hesitantly, Felicity stepped into the hall, placing each foot down deliberately before committing to the next. Of course, if the floorboards squeaked, what was she expecting to do? Ninja roll across the corridor like a heroine in some sort of spy novel?
Do not be ridiculous, Felicity. You are a scientist, an innovator. You should not be sneaking about in dark corridors.
A noise to her right made her freeze, her breathing, even her heart, still and silent. She stared wide-eyed into the darkness, knowing the staircase should be in front of her, waiting for monsters or bogeymen to emerge from nothingness behind her. None did, and after about 1,000,000 years, She allowed herself to breathe again.
Felicity, you have spent your life studying your cats. Felines move gently, but with certainty. Do that.
Right. Be like a cat. Be one with the cat. Be the cat. She could do this. Felicity rolled her shoulders, straightened her chin, and reached for where the banister would be. Be the cat. But as her fingers closed around the carved wood, she was grabbed from behind. She might have yelped, had her voice box not frozen in fear once again. As she was spun about and slammed against the wallpapered panelling, all she managed was a panicked little squeak. Quite similar to a kitten's, she realized belatedly. There was no time to consider this, however, before a weight settled against her, forcing her back, her shoulders, her rear end against the wall, and a hand grabbed the hair at her crown. As her unknown assailant tugged her head back, a corded forearm thrust against her throat. She didn't have time to worry about herself before a hushed voice hissed in her ear. "Damn you, I'll kill you if you've touched her." Her chest began to burn from holding her breath. He was the one touching her, wasn't he? Oh, yes, indeed he was. She closed her eyes, not that it helped at all, and forced herself to inhale. Yes, this was definitely a man holding her. Had the strength not corroborated her hypothesis, the faint scent of shaving soap and mint tooth powder would give her the data she needed. Breathing too fast now, she opened her eyes and responded the way any normal, rational-minded person would, which was, "What?" The man's hold on her hair tightened. "What, you bastard?" She swallowed past the impediment of his arm.
I mean, what in the bloody hell are you talking about?
Despite her fear, Felicity felt a moment of pride that she'd managed to keep her tone steady. During the last years, she'd been working to keep her accent from her voice, and lately it only appeared when she was worried or stressed. But now it seemed as if she'd finally succeeded from banishing it completely. Huzzah! Except for the whole being pinned to a wall by a stranger thing. To her surprise, her harsh language worked. The man pinning her loosened his hold on her hair as he sucked in a surprised breath. A woman! While he didn't release her, his forearm slackened a bit. You're a woman! She wanted to make a cutting, sarcastic remark on his powers of observation, perhaps dubbing him Mr. Obvious, but her tongue seemed to have become tied. She forced herself to inhale deeply, hoping that would help. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately from her point, all the action did was thrust her breasts against her assailant's chest. He cursed and leaned back as if branded. But his legs and hips were still pressed against hers, holding her in place, and she felt the unmistakable sensation of his growing interest. In the darkness, her eyes widened. His erection pushed against her pelvis and evoked an immediate response in her, which she hadn't expected. Her own core clenched in response, and when she sucked in another breath and drew the twin sense of him into her chest, she made the most embarrassing little whimper in response, and actually flexed her hips forward, cupping his hardness. You are sexually aroused by a stranger who is groping you in the dark. Oh dear, perhaps she'd been spending too much time studying A Harlot's Guide to the Forbidden and Delightful Arts, or another of her illicit, naughty books. The stranger, meanwhile, had gone very still. Now he cleared his throat. I feel I need some clarification. You are in fact a woman. Yes. She swallowed, easier now that his forearm rested against her collarbone instead of her throat.
Unless you are regularly burgled by men in gowns."
She felt him laugh, or rather she felt his quick exhale, that thing bulls sometimes did.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?